Tornázzunk egyet az angol rendhagyó igékkel. Én mondom angolul, hogy mit tervezek a jövő hétre. A kérdés, hogyan juttatnád ezt eszembe angolul 2 héttel később? Figyelj, itt egy példa. Ha azt mondom, next week I'll go shopping. Te így emlékeztetsz? Last week you went shopping. Kezdjük. Majd belejössz. Next week I'll write a letter. Last week, you wrote a letter. Next week, I'm standing up to my sister. Last week, you stood up to your sister. Next week, I'm sitting at my desk. Last week, you sat at your desk. Next week, I'm feeding cats. Last week, you fed cats. Next week, I'm digging in my garden. Last week, you dug in your garden. Next week, I'm throwing a party. Last week, you threw a party. Next week, I'm coming with you. Last week, you came with me. Next week, I'm taking you with me. Last week, you took me with you. Next week, I'm getting up late. Last week, you got up late. Next week, I'm waking the kids up earlier. Last week, you woke the kids up earlier. Next week, I'm sleeping in my own bed. Last week, you slept in your own bed. Next week, I'm laying low. Last week, you laid low. Next week, I'll shoot a film. Last week, you shot a film. Next week, I'm flying to Rome. Last week, you flew to Rome. Next week, I'm fighting for my dreams. Last week, you fought for your dreams. Next week, I'm cutting down on sugar. Last week, you cut down on sugar. Next week, I'm driving to work. Last week, you drove to work. Next week, I'm spending all my money. Last week, you spent all your money. Next week, I'm learning English. Last week, you learned English. Next week, I'm teaching you Spanish. Last week, you taught me Spanish. Ennyi angol rendhagyó ige, elég is mára. Ez volt az Angol Torna az Angolutcától. Szalai Gabriella tanulási szakértőt hallottad. Ha jöhet még egy, thumbs up a videó alatt.